Welcome to the 2021 Virtual Group Merchandising Conference. We are truly excited to provide yet another unique virtual experience via the Zoom platform to ensure the valuable one-on-one interactions that have become synonymous with the GMC. We hope you find the next 3 days to be a worthwhile investment in your business. To make the most of your meetings, here are some important pieces of information worth noting. All appointments are in Eastern Time. Please click on the appropriate link in your Excel schedule to join the correct main session at least a couple minutes prior to the start of your next meeting. Be sure to update your display name on Zoom to include your first name, last name, and company name. This will help your pro group host get you into the correct breakout room. To do this, visit zoom.us and edit your profile. The Ask for Help button can be used to invite the host to join your breakout room meeting to troubleshoot an issue like audio or video difficulties, screen sharing, file sharing, etc. The Leave Breakout Room icon lets you leave the breakout room and return to the main session. Use the Leave Meeting icon if you need to join a different main session. The phone number for technical support is 303-792-3000, option 1. We will have staff ready to assist you if you require more in-depth technical assistance. Despite training and planning, some factors like power and internet outages are beyond our control. If your meeting is interrupted or canceled due to technical difficulties, we will reschedule your meeting for a later date. A message to all distributor attendees: remember to fill out your vendor follow-up forms. For each appointment that a buyer or buyer team holds and then returns a completed form, a ticket will go into a drawing for one of 10 $250 cash grand prizes, sponsored by Pacer Technologies, the original superglue. The more appointments attended and the more completed forms returned, the more chances you have to win. We would now like to welcome our keynote speaker, Dan Trottenchek, Chief Operations Officer and Publisher with the North American Hardware and Paint Association. If anyone has questions during the presentation, please feel free to submit them through the Zoom chat function, and Dan will answer them at the end of the presentation. Thank you.
Hi, everybody, and thank you for allowing me to talk to the group today. It's been a while since we've been able to see everybody face to face, but I guess for now these virtual presentations are just the reality we're living with. But hopefully that'll be over soon, and we'll all be able to get back in the same room in the near future and get back to a little bit more like the way things used to be. Good that I'm talking about that, because that's kind of what we're going to be talking about in my presentation today. Is we're going to be talking about the impact that the pandemic of 2020 has had on the home improvement industry and the retailers on the independent side that serve that industry, and why there's a lot of things that occurred out of this pandemic that we're still trying to unpack and figure out what the impact of those changes that came about as a result of the pandemic are going to be over the long term. If you don't know who I am, I've gotten the opportunity to speak to this group a couple times before, but I am Dan Trottenchek. I am the Executive Vice President and Chief Operating Officer with the North American Hardware and Paint Association. And if you don't know, the NHPA, which used to be NRHA until October of last year when we welcomed paint and decorating retailers into our mix, we are the association that services independent home improvement and paint and decorating retailers. We've been around for over 120 years. We're a not-for-profit association. We're based in Indianapolis, Indiana. And our primary goal is to help hardware stores, home improvement, and paint and decorating retailers run better and more profitable businesses. And that's really all we do as a nonprofit. We look to do education, advocacy, and bringing groups together to learn from each other and the best practices they offer. So now that you know who I am, now that you know what we're here to talk about, let's get into it. And because, like I said, there is a lot to unpack with what we've seen over the last 12 months on the business side, on the impact that that's had on sales for the industry, and also on kind of some of the changes that consumers are going through that are going to kind of, as I said, have a long-term impact on the way we do business in the industry. There's one thing for sure, and that's there's no doubt that things have changed over the last 18 months. Whenever I have this kind of discussion and we talk about the pandemic and its impacts on business, I always just like to have a little disclaimer that while we're going to focus on the impact on businesses and consumer attitudes that we've seen over the last 12 to 18 months, that in no way is meant to diminish the real cost, the very real impact that this pandemic has had on people's lives. And that's obviously a very serious subject. And like I said, anytime we talk about business and how it's related to the pandemic, particularly in an industry like ours, where we talk about the upside of the impact in terms of business, again, I just like to really set the stage and say, we're not talking about this in a positive light without at least recognizing the very real damaging, devastating impacts that the pandemic has played on people's lives. But what it has done in terms of consumer attitudes and in terms of business within home improvement has a very real impact on sales and the way the industry operates. So I want to separate those two things and acknowledge that while we're going to focus for the next hour on the business impacts of it, we're not forgetting by any means the very real tragic impacts that the pandemic has carried. So what are we going to talk about in the next hour? We're going to talk about the fact that while the pandemic might not last, there's a lot of areas of North America, certainly in the United States, maybe a little less so right now in Canada, but in the United States where we're getting this kind of feeling that the pandemic is almost behind us. Right now, as I'm talking to you, we're at a point where almost 60% of the adult population in the U.S. has received at least some portion of their vaccination. We're just coming recently off of holiday weekends. We're heading into the summer months, and we're starting to get, at least I can kind of feel, we're starting to get this sense that life might be returning a little bit more to normal than it has in the past. But we can't think that just because we're getting back to doing some of the things we used to do, some of the things that we learned, the behaviors we learned, and the impact of the pandemic are just going to go away when we start taking off our masks and going to public places again. What I like to say about what we've seen with the pandemic and its business impacts, particularly in home improvement, is that it has really been an accelerator for change. It isn't necessarily that the pandemic itself has changed things, but what it's really done is speed up some changes that were really kind of cooking, if you will, even before the pandemic started. And we'll talk more specifically about some of those. And one of the things that is going to be key for businesses moving forward is really understanding what those changes have been and really embracing the fact that while we might begin talking about living and doing business in a post-pandemic world, we have to understand and acknowledge the real sea change that this event has caused for consumers and businesses, particularly in the home improvement area. What I would compare it to is when we talk about other moments in history that just caused these massive changes in behavior. Some of the things would be the gas crisis of the 1970s and how that changed consumer behavior for years to come. The Great Depression early in the 20th century that really shaped the way consumers behaved for years and decades beyond that. And we're really sitting at a time right now where we're seeing that kind of change taking place. To underscore that, I really, this is a quote that came out last year as part of a research project that was done by our friends at a company called Consumer Specialists. This company is run by a gentleman named Fred Miller. He used to be the executive director of the Home Improvement Research Institute. And Fred has spent his life doing research on consumer trends and specifically, at least for the last several decades, really focusing on consumer trends in home improvement. And they came out with a study where they analyzed analyzed consumer behavior during the pandemic and looking how consumer behavior towards home improvement was changing. And in the executive summary for the report, Fred, who, if you know Fred, he's a pretty even-keeled guy. He's a researcher kind of to the bone, and he doesn't make statements that are prone to hyperbole. And so it's why it was so striking to me in his executive summary for the report that he made this statement. In terms of consumer attitudes and behavior, there has never been a single force that has so significantly shaped the home improvement market as the impact of COVID and the pandemic. And for coming from a guy like Fred, who, like I said, is a researcher, even-keeled, lives his life by statistics and numbers, to make this kind of statement should really drive the message home that I was just making, is this event, what we have just been through and are still on the tail end of going through, is going to have lasting ripples in the home improvement industry that we as an industry have to recognize, understand, and as retailers, they need to adapt and react to this quickly. And anybody who is along that supply chain that works with retailers needs to understand what these changes are as well, so they can provide the kind of support and guidance that retailers need to understand and operate successfully in this new generation of consumer behavior. So before we dive into some of the ways that consumer behavior has fundamentally changed, I want to address a few of the things that happened in 2020. And I want to specifically talk about industry sales and some of the operational impacts that were really kind of a direct result of COVID being this catalyst and accelerator to changes. First off, everybody sitting in this room, everybody watching this video understands that the sales increases that the home improvement industry and home improvement retailers saw in 2020 were unlike anything we have ever seen. I have been working in the industry and watching the industry for nearly 3 decades. And while we have certainly seen sales increases during the late 90s and the DIY boom, kind of post-recession, we've seen the industry grow at a significant pace. Never at the pace and over the short period of time that we saw that kind of growth occur in 2020. And we all know, and I'll talk a little bit about some of the reasons for that. The pandemic and a lot of the changes that occurred so rapidly, it wasn't just on the sales side. Overnight, businesses found themselves, the retailers found themselves having to adjust their operations on the fly. And this catalyst for them making these immediate changes is going to have a lasting impact and had a dramatic impact on the way retailers even ran their operations. And lastly, we're going to talk about the fact that how the pandemic has fundamentally changed some of the economic realities that have a direct correlation to our industry and how companies in our industry perform. So let's take a look first at this big kind of 800-pound gorilla in the room, and that's the sales of 2020. And I want to walk through one of our jobs at NHPA is to kind of monitor the size of industry. We kind of look at sales and try and keep our hands and our fingers on the pulse of the industry. And that's been a big part of my job for at least the last 20 years at NHPA. And I have never had a time when we have been trying to follow industry sales where things have changed so rapidly that it becomes very difficult to even have an educated guess at where we're headed. What I want to share with you are some statistics as they occurred kind of throughout the pandemic, and then kind of a rear view mirror on where we think things have actually ended up for 2020. So during the pandemic, during the third quarter, we reached out to retailers and we asked them, how are sales going? We did this kind of regularly through the pandemic, but the last time we did it, before we prepared kind of our annual report that we usually put out in the December timeframe to kind of wrap up the year, we reached out to them in the third quarter. And at that point, about 87% of retailers said that year to date, they were experiencing sales increases in 2020 over what they had seen in 2019. Honestly, probably you might be shaking your head saying, wow, close to 90%. I was thinking it would be close to 100%. Well, remember, there were some areas that were affected and saw surges come at different times. Now, we're talking third quarter here. So some of those areas that maybe were on lockdown a little bit longer, or some of those companies that we follow that are part of the home improvement industry that are more related to contractors and remodeling, paint stores, painting contractors, that their kind of surge came a little bit later in the year. So at this time, time, about 88%, just shy of 90% of retailers were telling us that they had seen sales increases. At that time, they were also telling us that the average increase amongst these retailers who had seen sales increases was about 19.4%. Pretty darn healthy. And so what all that led us to do as we were creating our size of industry report for the end of the year was to plug this into the models that we kind of typically use. And I would use the same kind of formulas and forward-looking outlook to come up with, okay, if we know where we are kind of midway through the third quarter, we can pretty well, with consistency, model out what we're going to look like for the end of the year. And that led us to a size of industry report that indicated to us that at the end of 2020, the industry was going to end with sales of about $457 billion, which in and of itself would have represented about a 12.4% increase over 2019. So by any means, a healthy growth period year over year, one of the healthiest that we've ever seen as an industry. Just to contrast that, our friends over at the Home Improvement Research Institute, who also monitor size of industry, about that same time, I think it was in September that they came out with this report. They were a little bit more modest than we had seen on the home improvement product sales front, and they had said that they thought the industry was going to come in right around 440 billion, or about an 8.7% year-over-year increase. And just to put that in a little perspective, here are the kind of rear-looking numbers that the U.S. government publishes, and you can kind of look back and see over the last 5-year period, it's a pretty consistent growth pattern that we see for the industry, really ranging between a low of 2019, where we only saw about 1.9% growth, to a high of 2014, where there was about 5.5% growth. But most of it, if you take the average number in there, you're going to be somewhere in the 4% growth. And that's kind of what we typically relate to. So 8.7%, 12.4%, those are really impressive figures. But hold on, we're not done yet. Our Q4 models, when we plugged all this stuff in, really kind of showed sales flattening out in the fourth quarter of 2020. And the fact is, though, that those models weren't built around the kind of pandemic realities that we were facing. And what we saw was a fourth quarter that finished stronger than anybody could have anticipated. And when we go back and now we can look with the fortune of hindsight at where we finished 2020, we're thinking that we're going to see the industry, whenever we're crunching the numbers as we speak, as we get final results rolling in from 2020 from all of our retail contacts. But is that we're pegging that the industry for 2020 sales to be closer to $497 billion, which is significantly higher than our models were forecasting. But when you look at some of the results we've seen from some of the home improvement companies that make up the industry, it's no surprise. I mean, Home Depot reported comp sales increases of nearly 21%. Lowe's was at 26.1%. And our early results from the independent sector of the market, the independent home improvement retailers, are showing that we're pegging comp store increases for independents at right around 21.4% for 2020. So you put those all together, and it's going to be a significantly higher increase than what we had even predicted part of the way through the third quarter. But I want to spend just a second also talking about financial performance for independents beyond top line sales, because not only was it record-setting pace for top line sales for independents, but also most of their productivity measurements look like they're going to come in up as well. Something NHPA has done for nearly 100 years is we conduct our cost of doing business study. And this is where every year we gather real world financial data from thousands of home improvement, paint and decorating stores, and we compile that in aggregate and put it into a report called our cost of doing business study that gives you a very close look at the income statement, balance sheet, financial metrics for actual stores out there in the industry. And as we start to get some of those early figures in, so I'll caution you that some of this information is subject to change, but here are some of the early figures that we get in from some of the larger companies kind of representing the independent sector. And we're seeing that independents really saw growth in just about any measure. That adjusted gross profit increased by more than 25% for independent retailers in 2020. Independent retailers saw net income increase by more than 130% on average, while payroll and occupancy expenses were both down as a percentage of sales, and net operating profit was up on average by nearly 2 times for independent retailers. Was talking to a group recently, and one retailer made this comment was, over the past year, you just couldn't spend money fast enough to keep up with the sales increases that they were experiencing. So what that really translates to is not only did independent retailers in home improvement have a record sales year, but a lot of this is trickling down into profits. A lot of this is trickling down into opportunities for them to carry and invest in their business moving forward. But as we all know, in addition to the opportunities, there were also headwinds, and we'll discuss that just briefly. But things like labor is primarily one of them. The ability to have staff on hand to manage the growth. The other 800-pound gorilla standing next to the other 800-pound gorilla is the supply chain issues that I guarantee we're all aware of, and the fact that that was kind of a headwind to sales and continues to be. And lastly, the commodity pricing issues that are brought about by both demand and product shortage in a lot of areas. All of those are having a somewhat depressing effect as we look at sales growth opportunity moving forward. But what are some of the continued impacts? Let's talk a little bit about 2021. That's where 2020, we obviously ended on a sales and business high note for 2020. But some of the things we're seeing carrying forward in 2021 is one of the things that independent retailers are telling us is that because of supply shortages, because of challenges with logistics and supply chain, they're typically carrying more inventory, about 10 to 15% more inventory in 2021 versus even what they were carrying in 2020. And that's kind of being born out of this opportunistic buying. One retailer summed it up pretty well and said, right now, availability is trumping price. And if I see stuff out there that I know I'm going to sell through, I'm going to buy it. And I'll find a place to put it just so we have it on hand. And trying to manage these other inventory challenges creates, kind of downstream effects. We talked about that labor was a challenge. I think coming out of a difficult 12 months with employees just working under COVID environments. Now you add things like consistent multiple price changes that they're having to deal with, managing inventory, dealing with disgruntled customers. All those things create a downstream effect, which creates added stress on the labor force, which creates greater turnover, which kind of exacerbates other existing problems. But for all these challenges that retailers are facing, one, we don't see an easy solution. We don't see supply chain getting straightened out in the next few months. We don't see product shortages just resolving themselves in the next few months. And what retailers have basically told us is they're looking at a lot of these things as problems that are going to persist at least through the balance of this year. And I think that one of the things we're looking at is through the first quarter, and this is kind of an interesting anomaly too, that I think that a lot of us that work with independent retailers, or if you're an independent retailer yourself, you know that sometimes this group can tend to be a little bit, I guess there's no other to say it, but a little bit pessimistic in their outlooks, or we'll say conservative in their outlooks. And it was interesting throughout the course of the pandemic, the groups that I would talk to almost on a monthly basis would say things like, sales are great now, but I think they're going to fall off the cliff next month. I think they're going to fall off the cliff next month. And as we know, in 2020, they never really fell off the cliff. Well, as we were planning on what 2021 might look like, we kind of heard the same thing. Well, 2021, I'm going to budget flat to down. In fact, we did some research that showed the majority of retailers were going to be budgeting sales down over actual for 2020. Well, what we're tracking right now is that through the first quarter of 2021, that sales for independent retailers and home improvement are tracking at about 23% above 2020. Now, it's fair to note that the first several months of 2020 were not COVID impacted. And if you look back at the sales that we were posting during the first quarter of last year, it was about on par with what we typically expect for a late winter going into pre-spring. But that being said, now as we sit here, we're hearing results from April sales and some initial May sales results, and some of that is still comping at slightly up or flat. And then some of those retailers that I talked about earlier that were kind of slow to the party on sales increases, with contractors and tradesmen or so on, are seeing comping above even where they were through mid-year. So we have every reason to believe, and I was just talking with some analyst friends yesterday about this, this, that we're probably going to, while sales might flatten out for the balance of the year for independents, we think that the momentum that we're taking in through the first 6 months of the year is going to carry even through flat, or if we hit slightly down cycle that's more seasonally impacted like we typically see in this year, that we might finish 2021. Our initial projection from an HPA was we were going to be slightly down for sales in 2021 over 2020. And we think that we're going to be flirting with flat sales for 2020, if not perhaps a tick up. So I don't want to join the bandwagon where everybody says it's going to fall off the table next month, but let's just wait and see. For right now, let's take the win that's in our sales. So that's kind of the sales front. That's kind of the productivity front from some of the impacts that we've seen from COVID. But perhaps more importantly were some of the operational challenges that were brought about and retailers had to face as a result of this. And what this impact really led to was new ways of retailers managing their businesses on just about every single front. And not in addition to these new ways of managing the business, and I'll get into depth about that, there were also new metrics that became really important to retailers that they maybe didn't pay as much attention to before. And lastly, what we talked about is this whole concept of working through things like the supply chain that has been stressed and how retailers manage to keep up with the pace of increasing sales while dealing with those kind of challenges. All of those are going to have these lasting impacts as we move forward. So let's get into some of the lessons that we learned from the pandemic and why these are important to think about, how they're going to impact retailers, independent retailers specifically in the home improvement industry moving forward, and why everybody on the channel needs to really be aware of what these things were that we learned from the pandemic and the impact that they're going to continue to have as we move forward. And I say this because the things that we've all experienced over the last 12 to 18 months, there's not an on-off switch. And I'll get to this in a second. You could read the reports every day. Let's just talk about workers. There was just a report that came out that said 86%, I think it was tech workers, say they're not going to go back to working in the office on a regular basis. They would leave their job before they went back to that. That is something that happened as a result of the pandemic, but it's something that's going to persist moving forward. And that is one of those kinds of things that's going to fundamentally change the way everybody behaves. If 86% of workers in one field are saying, I'm not going to go back where I 8 to 5 work in an office again, that's going to change their home life. That's going to change everything they do and how they react to the environment around them. So those are the kind of things we're really looking at that aren't just that on-off switch that's going to go away. Those are the things that are going to persist. And number one among those is that right now, at this point in time, the concept of the home is more important to consumers. And I'll even put it out there. I think it's more important to consumers now than it ever has been in our modern history. And it's completely different this time around. Not only did the pandemic amplify what we would call this nesting effect. And by nesting, I mean, that concept that the home during difficult times or challenging times or even periods of life, the home becomes a safe haven and we tend to feather our nests. We tend to say, I want to retreat to my home and invest in my home and make my home a comfortable, safe place. Well, that was one of those things that was accelerated by the pandemic. It was one of those things that was tuned up on steroids and everybody was forced to be in their home, so they had to nest. But think about it this way too. The entire concept of the home has changed. It's not just a place where you keep your stuff and you park your cars and you have your food and you spend your evenings and you spend your nights and you sleep in your bed. Now it's all that. In many cases, it's become an office, and we just talked about how that's going to continue. In many cases, it's a school. In many cases, it's had to become your primary source of recreation. So all these things that the home really wasn't defined as, or maybe loosely defined as before, are now so present in this concept of home. A home has to meet functions across several definitions. And so how do you make your home an office, a part-time school, a recreational place? You invest in it. You spend money on home improvement. But you have to understand, if you're a retailer or anybody serving the channel, that this concept today is fundamentally different than it was 18 months ago. So what does this mean to the retailers serving this industry? They need to be prepared to meet these changing and expanded definitions of what the home is. If I am a retailer that is providing you products to maintain, enhance, and increase the safety of your home and your surroundings, you have to understand, how is the definition of home different today than it was 18 months ago? Something else you have to understand is something that's related to that, is the concept of DIY has been reborn. I remember specifically, I might have talked to this group years back about how we were all worried that the DIYer was dead, that the concept of DIY was evolving away as baby boomers aged out of DIY years, and millennials and Gen Z and all that weren't really apt to do DIY projects. Well, that started coming back before the pandemic, but man, the pandemic put that into high gear. Now, so many people that wanted and needed and had to do stuff around their homes, and for all the reasons we know, maybe didn't want to hire or bring in contractors, now we are creating a DIY baby boom, if you will. That sounds terrible, a DIY. I hope it's all DIY babies. But a do-it-yourself boom that's going to be born out of the pandemic. People who maybe didn't have the confidence to do it themselves before, who are now going to be able to DIY because they experienced and they were forced. That accelerator was tuned up, and now we're going to have these DIYers. And so the industry has to focus on home improvement retailers, but the entire industry has to keep focused on, how do we understand that the home has changed? How do we encourage DIYers? How do we empower them to utilize these new skills and keep that momentum going? Once they can go back to baseball games, once they can go back to concerts or take trips, how do we still keep them engaged and confident in doing projects around their home? So that's the primary thing that I wanted to mention about how the home has changed. Speaking of the things that we have to do to support this kind of new DIY trend is something else that we learned during the pandemic, and this was kind of supported and proved by Fred Miller and his group over at Consumer Specialists, is that consumers now are learning differently, specifically about home improvement projects, and retailers have to be prepared to respond to kind of this, one, the new wave of DIYers, the new support for these DIYers and what they need, but also how they learn. Consumers are gravitating away from in-store resources as their preferred method for learning about home improvement products and projects. And the research that Fred did, and I would encourage you guys all to check that out, just go to the Consumer Specialist website, and he gave this research away free to the industry, was they talked to over 1,000 consumers during the pandemic, and they asked them about their home improvement habits and how they buy products, how they research their projects, how they research products. And what they learned was that during the pandemic, a 12.2% increase in the number of consumers that said they are turning to their internet as their preferred source for information about home improvement products and projects. And this stands to reason, because they're sitting at home and they need to get information about a project. But again, it's an accelerator. Consumers were trending in this direction anyway, but during the pandemic, their options for gathering that information were more limited, so they turned to the internet. Well, now that's not going to go away. They've identified their favorite sources for gathering information and insights about home improvement, and that's what they're going to continue to turn toward in the future. And interestingly enough, Fred's research showed that the only areas that showed decreases in dependence or reliance for home improvement product and project information were in-store sales associates and in-store merchandising. And so, again, that stands to reason because fewer people were going into the store, but these are those habits that are going to persist post-pandemic. So what can the industry do to respond to this? And this is a big question for retailers and independent retailers specifically, but also the organizations that support those retailers. How will independent retailers be able to maintain their favored position as a reliable source for information on products and projects? How will they be able to maintain their position as the primary delivering vehicle for product knowledge? I mean, independent retailers always say, well, one of the ways we set ourselves apart is by delivering better product knowledge and better insights and better support than the big boxes do, and certainly than online-only providers. Well, in an environment where consumers are trending away from those in-store interactions, how do independent retailers maintain that position? they're going to need to tap into resources like social media, like their own e-commerce, like their own websites, new things, Zoom training, Zoom classes, some of those things that we all did and learned about during the pandemic. Independent retailers and those that support them are going to have to embrace that because consumers are moving toward that. And like I said, remember that accelerator. The pandemic pushed the gas pedal down on the way consumers gather information online for their home improvement products and projects. The other thing, and these are kind of the top three, and then we'll get down to some other ones, but another big thing that changed during the pandemic is just new shopping habits. People shop in different ways today than they did prior to the pandemic, and that is not going away. Consumers have discovered new, more convenient models for shopping that have forever changed the shopping paradigm, and there is no reason to think that consumers are going to go back to normal when the pandemic ends. And right now, consumers are expecting retailers to be able to deliver on these fronts. And some of this is already happening. And we'll talk about what this means to retailers, but let me give you a very stark example of what I mean by consumer behavior has changed specifically with shopping habits. And this is something that just happened this week. I was working from home, and my wife had an appointment that she had to leave for. And 5 minutes after she left, the doorbell rang. And I was like, who's at our house? And of course, like everybody, we have one of the video doorbells. So I look on the video doorbell, and it's a delivery person with my wife's grocery order. She didn't expect it for a while because she was just running out and coming back, but he was delivering our groceries. And it prompted a conversation when my wife got back. And I said, I'm just joking, like, honey, we can't go to the grocery store now. And she's like, yeah, but it's just so easy. When I'm sitting there doing my bills and responding to emails, I'll just put in a grocery order and it comes through. She's not going to change that. She discovered a new way to shop, and that's not going to go away. And it's not going away. My wife and I have both been vaccinated for some time now, so we feel safe going into a grocery store. My wife just says it's more convenient for me to do it this way, and it's the same thing that shoppers are discovering everywhere, and that's not changing. We found that things like buy online, pick up in store, curbside pickup, all those things that consumers found useful aren't going to go away. So for the retailers, how do you understand and adapt to this? Because you have to understand there will be some trickle back. There's a lot of people that say, oh, I'm kind of glad to get back and go to the store and so on. But there's an equal number, if not a greater number of people that will say, going forward, I might go back to the store, but I'm probably going to blend it in with some of the things that I've done in the past. And that's just behavior that's not going to unwind once we all take our masks off. So retailers are going to need to understand, where do I adapt my operation to meet these changed needs of consumers? And again, the companies that support those retailers, the distributors, the vendors, are going to have to do their best to offer the tools to make that happen, to enable those changes in a smooth and seamless way. And I'm glad to say, and this is another point coming a little later, that a lot of independent retailers have actually really begun that adaptation. So it's really about refinement moving forward. Something else that's changed, and this is definitely a positive for independent retailers in the market space. And on the surface, this seems like a counterintuitive statement, but the concept of community has both expanded and contracted as a result of COVID. And what do I mean by that? Is that our communities got both larger and smaller. There's really no way to say that. And here's a good example, maybe to graphically illustrate exactly what I'm talking about. A few weeks ago, I am part of an international organization of, believe it or not, there's an association for everything, but I'm part of an association of hardware home improvement associations from around the world. And we get together, and throughout the pandemic have gotten together regularly on Zoom calls. I probably talked to these individuals from France and Sweden and Japan and Australia more regularly in the past year than I have in any other year before that. Typically, we'd see each other once a year for a meeting and a conference, and then we'd go our separate ways. Well, now we're almost getting together on a monthly basis. And so our world that was so geographically far apart has now contracted, and we're seeing each other more because we're utilizing something like Zoom to keep in better contact. But at the same time, what has happened during during the pandemic, particularly as it's kind of an offshoot of a lot of negative results, is that as consumers have seen the real impact of what the pandemic has done on their local communities. And what I mean is, you look around, and I could ask everybody in the crowd to just think in your head right now, what is a local business that you've lost that has gone away during the pandemic? I can think of several in our community that were some of my wife and my favorite places to patronize that are just gone now. And in addition to that, it really gets everybody thinking about, wow, if we're not there to support these local businesses, we're going to lose them. And I think everybody got that really stark kind of picture of, I don't know that we want to be in a community. These small businesses that make up our community are what makes us want to be in our community. So right now, while we've seen our communities expand, we're also filled with this sense of, wow, my local community is really important and I need to support that. So what does this mean to retailers and the people that support them? What it means is that retailers need to look at both expanding their reach, but also leveraging that concept of convincing consumers and showing consumers that, listen, we are a small business. We serve your community. I live down the street from you. My kids go to school the same place your kids go to school, and really reinforcing the locality, but using these tools that we've been given to expand your reach, having things like Zoom consultations with customers, having things like virtual workshops, having things where you're utilizing technology to broaden your reach, e-commerce access. So believe it or not, consumers like to look at stores and see what's going on. Let me pull up the store camera and see how busy it is right now. Things like that just expand your world while also bringing people close together. So let's transition a little bit and talk about some of the kind of operational and in-store things that we've seen change that aren't likely to change anymore. And this is more around some of the concepts that were really reinforced as important during the pandemic. And I also think that a lot of these things are particularly well suited for independent retailers. And the first thing is that one thing we learned is that agility is more important now than it ever has been in the past with the business. So many independent retailers throughout the pandemic did well, were able to leverage the new business that came their way because they were agile. And what we really saw in many cases was it as simple as being agile equals my ability to serve customers and being open, whereas being slow to react really could be the end of my business. I mean, it was put there right in front of them. So agility wasn't a nice skill to have. It was a necessary skill to embrace as a business. And this applied to every area of a retailer's operation, not just the customer-facing ones. Retailers had to rethink structure. They had to think about how do I buy in ways that I haven't bought before? How do I source products when I can't get them through a typical source? How do I staff my store when half my team I can't have in because they're immunocompromised? How do I change my hours? How do I establish curbside pickup out of nothing? And all those things, those changes that were made, again, like I said, it goes back to this concept of the pandemic accelerated a lot. A lot of these things were things the business should have been thinking about anyway. They're probably just good business practices, but man, now all of a sudden it was not a luxury to think about them. It was a necessity to think about them. And agility was really the key to success. So what does this mean? How do retailers plan around this? It really is about creating a structure for retailers to be more nimble. And as suppliers, as providers, it means, how do we work with our customers? How do we help support that agility? How do we help them with new initiatives? How we provide them tools to be more agile? And one of the things I say here to retailers, and is good business practice for anybody, is, but you have to remember the old adage that if you're going to try new things, don't be scared to try new things. Try a lot of new things, but if you're going to fail fast. If you do something and it's not working, get out of it and go on to the next thing. And again, as retailers or as companies that work with and supply retailers, anything you can do to support this is going to be worthwhile endeavor. And a quick note for companies that are suppliers, and as this relates to the supply chain, everybody's having problems with the supply chain, but manufacturers, this is important to remember too, is that right now, I have another quote that I use in a different kind of presentation where a retailer said, one of the things that the pandemic has taught us was to buy better than we ever have before. And so right now, retailers, because of the supply chain challenges, are starting to think about, maybe I need to broaden kind of my concept about how I acquire products. So for manufacturers and distributors looking to gain market share, right now is a pretty good opportunity to start reaching. And I know a lot of those companies are also facing some of those supply chains and logistics problems, but it also presents a good opportunity to say, maybe you always carried brand A, and brand A is having a tough time fulfilling stuff, so maybe now's a good time to try brand B. So just a side note as it remains to add agility. Number 6, and this goes without saying, and I know that I've said this to retailers before. I used to give a presentation about how to protect your business and to compete against the Amazons of the world. And I would always say, if you're not online, you need to get a program and need to start thinking about getting online. It's not an option anymore. If you're not online with your business and you can give any excuse that you want to give, you are going to go out of business, period. Customers have been trained during the pandemic. They have learned that online is my primary source of communication with the outside world, period. And if you do not have a website as a retailer, then you need to have one, or you need to start thinking about how you're going to liquidate your inventory, because you will go out of business. And you could say, well, Dan, because I live in a rural area and my customers aren't online. BS. If one thing they learned during the pandemic was how to get online and how to shop online and how to do it. And if your customers aren't, I guarantee you their sons and daughters and grandkids are, and they're going to be your customers if you want to be in business beyond 3 or 4 years. So in 2021, there is no choice but to be online and also to be working towards having an e-commerce opportunity. So distributors, manufacturers, what you have to do is work to say, how can we help retailers facilitate this? And I'm happy to say that I think that was one of those things during the pandemic that independent retailers really responded to. They really quickly ramped up e-commerce, really quickly ramped up online. And what we saw in a lot of cases was I think I heard, I could get it wrong, but it was something on this order of retailers that who had e-commerce saw in some months their sales up by 4,000% on their e-commerce orders over pre-pandemic levels. So retailers have to have a strategy for how they're going to implement online and e-commerce in their business, and distributors and manufacturers need to support that strategy. I will point out that when it comes to home improvement, buy online, pick up in store, or curbside pickup is still really the preferred method that consumers are telling us about how they want to do business. Another plug for an industry friend, the folks over at the Farnsworth Group, who run their COVID tracker index, and they give it away for free. So go to the farnsworthgroup.com/COVID, and you can sign up to get the COVID tracker. But one of the things they tracked that was interesting was where consumers are buying products. And so if you're one of those people that's going to still fight against what I'm saying and say, Dan, well, we mostly do business with contractors, guess what? Look at their research, and it shows that remodelers and contractors are also wanting to engage with home improvement retailers online. So we're done with excuses. There are no more excuses. You need to be online, and you need to be working towards an e-commerce strategy, and the companies that support retailers need to support that and make it as easy as possible. Point 7 is, we had retailers on our board of directors at NHPA tell us this before. Their biggest disadvantage that they face in competitive issues is scale disadvantage, is that they could compete more effectively against Home Depot, against Amazon, against Lowe's, if they had greater scale to solve problems. And that is something that I am proud that during the pandemic, I think retailers began gravitating towards that. At NHPA, we sponsor roundtable groups where we have retailers come together to discuss best practices. During the pandemic, these groups told us, we want to get together more. It's more important now for us to talk about ways to share information and kind of lift each other up. And this scale disadvantage coming out of this, when we talk about things like e-commerce, when we talk about things like supply chain, when we talk about things like sourcing product or buying effectively or importing product, this scale disadvantage that independent retailers face is a real challenge. And other companies in the industry that are going to be successful are the companies that are going to look for ways to partner together, look for ways to really reach out to independent retailers and help them create advantage of scale. That is going to be things like combining together to do research to help customers, coming up with programs for e-commerce and things like that, providing data and information to companies that they can't have access to on their own. And those are the kind of companies that independent retailers are going to gravitate towards and want to do business with. So what this means for retailers is retailers are going to continue to look beyond the walls of their own business. Independent retailers understand, and it became stark during the pandemic, that I can't be insular. I need to learn. I know what I'm doing, but I need to learn what other retailers are doing. I need to get information. I need to share information and best practices with other folks, and that is how I'm going to be more successful. And this does not go away once the pandemic is done. The relationships that were forged, the alliances that were formed will not just dissolve once the pandemic is gone. The other thing, and I say this about retailers because I think it's something they've realized, but I think it's important for all companies, is, we spend a long time talking and thanking and patting our employees on the back and saying, thank you for all the hard work. Thank you for being essential. And they were there for us, and they were there during the height of the pandemic. And I think retailers are realizing that their relationship with their employees has changed. That's one part of it. The other thing that's changing, which is a positive, I think that they've not that they've ever had a lack of appreciation for their employees, but I think it's really kind of shown that, man, we can't do this without our employees. On the other side, there's other kind of big seismic shifts taking place in areas like wage pressures, and those are new things that are being put on retailers that were really also accelerated by the conditions we've seen in the last month. The wage pressures are also related to everything from daycare to work from home policies to stimulus. All those things play a hand in it, and retailers are having to really rethink, what does this relationship with employees look like moving forward? And concepts like loyalty, flexibility, and support, those are just so important in working with employees now that maybe probably more so than they ever have been. And I think things like, what this is going to mean in a retail environment is wage pressures aren't going to go away. Flexibility is going to have to kind of remain. This concept of being more flexible around, when you're coming in, what our hours are, how we're going to staff our operations. Retailers are going to have to continue to do that beyond just kind of COVID. And I think the other thing is, during COVID, employees got a lot of recognition. They got a lot of pats on the back. And if that just dries up, it's going to be like, well, wait a minute. I mean, we're still working every day. We're still supporting the business. We're still kind of the heart and soul of this, but now we're not getting pats on the back. And so retailers are going to have to continue to kind of embrace that. We talked about agility earlier, and my number 9 point here is that businesses that do not adapt will go away. And I'm just trying to be as blunt as possible here. There won't be any fanfare. There won't be any epitaph. It's just going to be, if you cannot adapt to these new market conditions, you will go away. We saw it in the restaurant industry, and it was tragic when you were losing so many bars and restaurants and hotels and privately owned businesses. And we all said, oh, it stinks. My favorite restaurant's gone. Beyond that, people aren't going to think about it anymore. They're going to move on to the businesses that were able to adapt. And it's no different in home improvement. There's not going to be articles online and tributes to the company. It's just going to go away. So during COVID, businesses, the loss of businesses, consumers kind of became numb to it. And so this thought that the consumers are going to mourn your business if you can't figure out ways to adapt to the new environment is just not the case. And one thing we've learned is that during difficult times and good times, oftentimes the winners and losers become more pronounced. We had a very challenging 18 months, and the people that were able to adapt and figure out how to do things quickly are the ones that are around, and just much more quickly, the other ones were called. And the markets simply don't abide businesses that can't adapt. So what does this mean for everyone? And this isn't just for retailers. It means you cannot wait to make changes to your business until your customers are demanding them. By the time your customers are saying, why don't you have availability for me to look at what you have online? Most of the customers have already just transitioned to another business. So you can't wait to make those changes, and retailers can't wait. So So as parts of the industry that support retailers, we need to be pushing them forward. We need to be saying, man, don't wait. Don't sit here and say, I don't think my customers want this. You need to push them to that and say, man, the ship is getting ready to sail. And if you're not on it, they're not coming back for you. The other part of this that is so important is that right now, retailers, what did we start talking about? It was a great sales year. It was a great profitability year. So retailers have the opportunity to make these investments in their business, make these capital investments in expansion, make these investments in infrastructure, make these investments in e-commerce. They have the ability right now. So they've been given this great gift of having, being able to see where we need to go, but also having the resources at hand to make those choices. And the last thing I want to leave with as far as changes is we are, and I can't pound my hands on the desk hard enough, we are not going back to the way things were. We will not go back. Consumers and businesses have fundamentally changed because of what's occurred in the last 18 months. Like I started with, a lot of these changes were already in the pipeline. But what has happened is the last 12 to 18 months have just sped those up, and they are here, and we're not hitting reverse anytime soon. And it's not just the pandemic. The pandemic was a catalyst, but again, it magnified things. But these changes were were already in the works because they were things that consumers wanted and they were gravitating towards. And businesses need to be able to react. This is a tremendous opportunity for businesses to get this right. Like I just said, we've been given an opportunity to reset everything we do, and you need to use it. Whenever we go through one of these accelerating events, it can have very positive and very negative impacts. And one of the things that I've said is now we're going into summer, so this might be quite not quite as apt as it was a little bit earlier in the year, but it was apt to me. Is when I was a kid and we would get a snow day. For me, it was always oh, thank God, now I don't have to do my homework between periods because I could take time. I never did it. I just ended up not doing it. But that's what I would tell myself is I could take this day to do my homework and get caught up. And our industry and independent retailers need to use what we've just been given as our snow day. We have this opportunity to catch up. We have the resources to catch up, and we know where consumers want to go with us, so we can't squander this opportunity. So really quick, what's next? If you don't have a plan for addressing kind of post-pandemic things that we've just talked about, you need to develop it now. As a retailer or as a business that's serving retailers, you need to sit down and you need to develop a plan. And what I always say with this is it doesn't need to be meeting after meeting and spreadsheets and all. It can be however you want, but it could be as simple as sitting down with a legal pad and a cup of coffee and saying, what am I going to do about e-commerce? What are we going to do to support retailers here? What are we going to do about some of these buying challenges? And making a list. Start there. And it doesn't need to be complicated, but for God's sakes, have a plan. And you need to be more comfortable in every aspect of your business with being more flexible. If one thing that we've learned out of the pandemic is that we have to be flexible. We have to be flexible with employees. We have to be flexible with relationships. We have to be flexible with the way we do business, with learned business practices. But that we need to embrace as a way to be flexible and agile with the way we operate and go about business. And lastly, just an admonishment, do not let the opportunities that you've been afforded go to waste. And I go back, and I've said this plenty of times before, but I still think it's so important to say it. Early on in the pandemic, a retailer in one of our roundtable groups said, listen, we are very privileged right now. We're privileged that we could be open while other businesses are closed. We're privileged that we can service our communities and help them in their time of need. And I would just say as a whole industry right now, the whole beginning of this, where I'm talking about, other industries, stomachs are turning. If I talk about, well, I don't know, we don't know if it was a 14% increase or a 22% increase in sales, where other industries were really watching their operators just be devastated by the impacts of this. We are privileged to be in the position we are in as an industry right now, and for no other reason than taking advantage of that. We cannot squander that opportunity. So manufacturers, retailers, distributors, we need to work together to take advantage of this and make the independent segment of the industry stronger, more suited to the new realities of post-pandemic consumer life, and better prepared to deal with the future than we ever have before. Thank you guys so much. I always enjoy the opportunity of speaking to the group, and I appreciate it. Please take this stuff to heart and let us know if NHPA can help you out in any way moving forward. Thank you.